Okay, this is chapter 3, Creating Anglo America, and this is the time period 1660 to 1750. So the Spanish have established colonies in Central and South America, in southwest present-day United States. The French are controlling Canada and in the areas between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And here on this map, we see an image of um, Britain's 13 colonies. So the origins of these colonies made up with many English, the French, Germans, Dutch, of course, a lot of African slaves. Many different groups composed this area. So the mercantilist system was prevalent in this 100-year period, and the government's going to regulate economic activity to promote national power. So they're going to encourage manufacturing, lots of trade. They're going to try to bring as much gold and silver into the country, and the idea was that if you can bring more gold and silver into the country than it's coming out of it, then you're doing it right. So the North American colonies are going to generate tremendous wealth for the mother country. And in order to try to control this Atlantic trade, the British will pass the Navigation Acts in 1651. So all goods produced will be shipped to England. The revenues will be collected, and the English merchants and manufacturers, shipbuilders, the sailors are all going to benefit. So the idea of the colonies is to make the mother country rich. Originally, where New York is today, that was an area conquered by the Dutch, known as New Netherland. And that was seized by the British in 1664 by the Duke of York. And you'll never guess what they named the city after that. And this is going to result in an Anglo-Dutch war in which the British will conquer Dutch trading posts in Africa. English colonists are going to complain that they are denied their English liberties, like the right to consent to taxation. So we'll see this early origins of rebellion many years before the American Revolution. And we'll have the Charter of Liberties, in which the Duke of York agrees to call an elected assembly, which is going to affirm the traditional English religious and political rights. So the origins dating back to the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about. All of these ideals were important to English citizens, and it's going to spread to the future United States. The founding of Carolina. It was to check the Spanish expansion from Florida, and colonists there in Carolina will trade with local Indians. They're going to hire them to fight against the Spanish, and they're also going to raid Indian communities looking for Indian slaves. Later, African slavery is going to become dominate the South and also the Chesapeake region, and the rice plantations were initially incredibly advantageous. William Penn is a Quaker, or was a Quaker, and he's going to advocate religious toleration within his colony. And so Pennsylvania is the holy experiment. It was a space for harmony between European migrants and Indians. Penn believed that Indian lands were theirs and needed to be bought, not just taken. Here's an image of William Penn's treaty with the Indians. And the Quakers believed in equality of all persons, whether you were a woman, black, Indian, and they believed in no fighting at all. They were pacifists, so no militias. They paid the Indians for their lands, and the Charter of Liberty ensured religious freedom for all in 1682. So this will attract migrants from all over Europe, and unfortunately, many whites that came to the colony were not Quakers and had no qualms about pushing deep into Indian territory and taking it. Indentured servants chose to migrate to Pennsylvania rather than Virginia or Maryland because the land was cheaper there. And with less indentured servants in Virginia or Maryland, there was an increased desire for African slavery, so it had an adverse effect. The English are going to view the Irish and the Native Americans and Africans as uncivilized, as pagans, savages. And for the English, they're going to divide humanity between those that were either civilized and those that were barbarian or Christian or not Christian. And because the Africans had a darker skin color, a different religion, and had practices that were not English, they were deemed enslavable. And that was their justification. African slaves who became free still had a skin color that whites associated with slavery. So really, they had no chance of equality in this free society, which lingered on for hundreds and hundreds of years and is still a factor today. The West Indies depended heavily on slavery. The sugar plantations were incredibly lucrative, and sugar was going to mass marketed to European consumers. So this was not only the most important product for the British, but also the French and the Portuguese empires as well. And slavery is going to grow slowly in the British colonies, but eventually indentured servitude will be pushed aside, and slavery will be in full force in the 1700s. In Virginia and Maryland, free blacks were allowed to sue and testify in court. They could acquire land, they could purchase white servants even, and other black slaves, but we'll see these changing laws not soon after. Here is a scene depicting an English handkerchief, male and female slaves working in the tobacco fields. Tobacco, along with rice and later king cotton, will be staples of these southern plantations. In the Chesapeake region, areas like Delaware and Maryland, tobacco planting is going to spread, labor demand is going to increase, and black opportunities for freedom will soon be restricted. New laws mandated that children of free enslaved parents would have the legal status of their mother, which essentially guarantees that a child would be the master's property. So if an African woman is raped by a white slave owner, the child, even though half white, would thus be considered a slave. Virginia Governor William Berkeley gave the best land to the wealthy planters, and the poor whites lost their rights to vote, and they were forced to the frontier lands, which were not as good for farming and also more dangerous. And that led to Bacon's Rebellion, where small farmers are going to burn Jamestown to the ground. They're going to attack plantations. But the outcome was that tobacco planters are going to reject the indentured servants for African slaves. So they deem these white indentured servants as trouble, and for them it was easier just to get African slaves. They would have them for life, and also it's going to change the dynamics in the South forever. So it's going to become a slave society between 1700 and 1750. Blacks are going to constitute 50% of the colony's population, rising up from 10%. Almost all of them were slaves, and new slave codes that are passed will define slaves as property, and these colonies became slave societies. 1675, King Philip's War. There was an alliance of Indian tribes led by Metacom, also known as King Philip, in southern New England, Connecticut. They're going to attack English farms and settlements. Half of the 90 New England towns were destroyed. Settlers were aided by local Indian tribes, are going to launch a counterattack in which Metacom is killed, and they're going to crush the rebel natives. 1,000 New England colonists died, which was 2% of the total population, and 15% of the Native Americans died, which is just an enormous sum of people. 1688 over in England was a glorious revolution, and there was always the question of will a Catholic rise to the throne? And William and Mary, who were both Protestants, are brought over from exile and put as king and queen of England. And this is some years after the English Civil War. And Parliament enacted a Bill of Rights, which they signed, which is going to guarantee more freedoms for English citizens, and it's going to balance England as a constitutional monarchy. So the king and queen will still have power, but Parliament's power was equal, and Parliament's power will continue to increase. Back in Massachusetts, the Salem witch trials, witchcraft, which had been around throughout the Middle Ages and led to thousands and thousands of deaths, usually women. Witchcraft was punishable by hanging, and most of the accused women who were outspoken, independent, or separated from their husbands, or just kind of went against the gender norms, they were deemed as witches. And because witches' powers challenge God's will, and also challenge men as head of the family. That's why they were sought after. Oftentimes, when a woman was accused of witchcraft, in order to save themselves, they would name others, usually unfounded, and there were legal charges against 150 different people in 1691, mostly women, and eventually 19 men and women were hanged as witches. But this witchcraft craze will discredit the prosecution of witches, and luckily this was a short period of time. Here's an illustration from Cotton Mather's. I'm not sure if that's a real picture. Origins and status of migrants to British North American colonies. If you're interested, show you the breakdown of people coming over from Africa and Europe as well. In total, nearly 600,000 moving to the British colonies. Many Germans came over, 100,000. Many of them were Catholics. Some of them were from small dissenting Protestant sects who were fleeing persecution. Others were trying to escape the poor economic conditions in Europe. And there was lots of religious diversity in the colonies. Religious toleration defined religious life. In the Great Awakening, we'll see many groups like the Lutherans and the Mennonites, the Anabaptists, Presbyterians, even Jews and Muslims were free to worship in the British colonies. Even if they were taxed and had to support officially the church and were banned from public office, they could still practice their religion. The Indians were very much threatened by these newcomers to America, and those that survived were forced to blend into the British Empire through trade, through the use of British goods, by making alliances and wars with the French and also the Spanish. We're going to see a lot of regional diversity as well. New England and the frontier settlements were typically characterized by small farms and families running the farms themselves. The middle colonies like New York, Jersey, Pennsylvania, farmers often produced for commercial markets using non-family or slave labor. And in the Deep South, we'll see a huge reliance on slavery. The Atlantic world, the ocean was a highway that was linking these communities and economies between all of these great European empires. Sugar, tobacco, other products are going to be marketed throughout Europe. London bankers are going to finance the slave trade between Africa and the Caribbean and the Portuguese Brazil. And Spain will spend its gold and silver importing goods. A lot of Spanish money will wind up over in the Philippines and in China. And North Americans are going to ship farm products to Britain and to the West Indies, and they're going to bring back slaves and rum. So we have these triangular trade happening, a lot going on. Social classes. The colonial elite in New England, a powerful merchant class emerged from the growing trade. The slave plantations were incredibly profitable for the Chesapeake and the lower South. And enormously wealthy planters are going to rule these colonies' governments up until the time of independence. The term I can't say that word, Anglicization, still didn't get it right. Colonies were more closely connected to England than ever, and even more so than to each other. And this is the idea that colonists saw themselves more as English citizens living in America than as Americans. And here we have the Atlantic trade. You see all the shipping that's happening. South Carolina, an aristocracy evolved. They're going to live lavish lifestyles. Freedom was based on power as superiors to rule over dependents, their slaves. And this freedom from having to labor all day and to live a life of luxury, that defined the gentleman. A lot of poverty happening in the colonies. The slaves lived in terribly oppressive and impoverished conditions. The number of poor without property continued to grow. There was less land to buy in the future, and we'll see a growth in wage labor. Here we see cutting sugar cane, which is an incredibly horrific job. A high death rate, especially in the Caribbean. But most Americans, well, most free Americans, were small farm families. Two-thirds of the free male population owned land, whereas in England, 60% of England's population owned no land at all. And land ownership was viewed as a right, and a lot of resentment against Native Americans or colonial governments that tried to limit this access to land, and we'll see this link between land ownership tied to freedom. All right, that is going to conclude chapter 3.